1:17 a.m., the Central Persian Gulf, 61 nautical miles northeast of Bahrain. 9 Iranian fast attack boats opened fire on USS Gettysburg simultaneously from 3 different bearings at 300 meters range. Not one boat, not a warning shot. 9 boats, 12 rockets, 300 meters. The first volley hit the ship before general quarters finished sounding. Welcome to Navy Beacon, where we break down the operations that define sea power. USS Gettysburg is a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser. She is 567 feet long. She displaces 9,800 tons fully loaded. Her Aegis combat system can simultaneously track and manage engagements against over 100 separate air contacts. Her magazine holds 122 vertical launch system cells containing a mix of SM-2 and SM-6 standard missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. She is, by most measures, one of the most powerful surface warships in the world. None of that mattered at 300 meters. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser's weapon systems are optimized for threats at range. Anti-ship missiles incoming from 40 miles, aircraft at altitude, submarines detected by sonar at distances measured in thousands of yards. The ship's close-in weapons, 2 Mk-38 25mm chain guns, 250 caliber heavy machine gun mounts, the phalanx system, are secondary. They are there. But the operational doctrine, the watch-standing, the tactical mindset of a cruiser crew is built around the long-range threat picture. 9 fast boats at 300 meters is not a long-range threat. It is a close-range ambush. And it is a type of attack that a Ticonderoga-class cruiser's crew trains for, but that the ship's design has never fully solved. To understand how 9 IRGC boats got within 300 meters of a U.S. Navy cruiser without triggering a defensive response, you need to reconstruct the 38 minutes before the attack. USS Gettysburg had been operating in the Central since 2200 the previous evening, a standard surface patrol tasking, coordinating with Bahraini Coast Guard on a joint maritime security protocol. The area around her was well trafficked at all hours. Commercial fishing dhows, small cargo vessels, Bahraini patrol boats, and the occasional recreational craft all generated contacts on the ship's surface search radar throughout the night. Managing those contacts, logging them, tracking them, assigning threat classifications, was routine work for the ship's surface warfare coordinator. At 0:39 a.m., the surface warfare coordinator on watch, Petty Officer First Class Jefferson, logged a cluster of 9 small contacts at ranges between 2 and 4 nautical miles. Each contact was moving at between 8 and 12 knots on independent, non-parallel headings. Each contact was consistent with a small commercial fishing vessel, or coastal dhow. Not one of the 9 contacts was moving toward USS Gettysburg at high speed. Not one was on a direct intercept bearing. Not one had triggered the automatic threat classification threshold. They were scattered. They were slow. They were, by every available metric, exactly what they appeared to be. Small commercial vessels operating in the Gulf at night. What they were actually doing was positioning. The 9 IRGC fast attack boats, a mix of Siraj-class and lighter fiberglass hull craft, had deployed from a small coastal facility north of Qatar 4 hours earlier. They had transited separately at commercial vessel speeds with civilian pattern navigation light configurations. Each boat had been assigned a specific position relative to USS Gettysburg's patrol track, calculated to place it at a predetermined bearing and range when the attack commenced. The attack plan had a specific geometric objective: place boats on 3 different bearings around the ship simultaneously, each group at a different range, so that when they all opened fire at once, the ship's defensive weapons would face targets in multiple arcs simultaneously, including arcs that partially overlapped and created deconfliction problems for the gun crews. At 1:17 a.m., every boat received the same signal. All 9 accelerated simultaneously. From their scattered positions, they converged at 40+ knots. The distance to USS Gettysburg, ranging from 200 meters to 400 meters depending on starting position, was covered in under 20 seconds for the closest boats. The surface warfare coordinator, Petty Officer Jefferson, saw the simultaneous acceleration on his screen at 1:17:04 a.m. All 9 contacts, all at once, all turning toward the ship, all accelerating. He immediately reached for the general quarters alarm. He was 4 seconds too slow. The first rockets hit the ship at 1:17:08 a.m., 4 seconds before general quarters sounded. The weapons the 9 boats carried were 107mm unguided rockets. artillery-type rockets mounted on improvised launchers bolted to the boat's decks and gunnels. Each boat carried between 4 and 8 rockets. The rockets were not guided. They flew ballistically after launch. Whatever direction and elevation the launcher was pointed at the moment of firing. At 300 meters range, that meant a dispersion pattern of approximately 20 to 40 meters around the aim point. Unguided, not precision weapons, but at 300 meters you don't need precision. The first volley, 12 rockets from the 3 closest boats, arrived at USS Gettysburg in under 1 second. All 12 were in the air simultaneously. Their dispersion pattern covered an arc approximately 40 meters wide and 20 meters tall, centered on the ship's bridge and forward superstructure. 3 rockets struck the ship in the first second. The first hit the forward superstructure, above and to the right of the bridge. It struck an equipment room housing secondary electronics and communications relay panels. The detonation, a 107mm rocket, carries approximately 3 kilograms of high explosive, was not large by naval combat standards, but it was sufficient to destroy the compartment's interior, start a fire, and send fragmentation through both internal bulkheads. The second rocket hit the port side of the ship at the upper deck level, striking an equipment locker and the davit mounting for one of the ship's rigid hull inflatable boats. The explosion destroyed the RHIB and its cradle and left a 2-foot hole in the deck plating. The third rocket hit the Mark 45 5-inch gun mount housing, the armored exterior casing around the gun mechanism. It did not penetrate the armor. The fuse, designed to detonate on contact with metal, functioned, but the armor plate absorbed the blast. The gun mechanism inside was undamaged. If the fuse had not functioned correctly, the warhead would have been sitting against the gun mount casing unexploded. That would have been a different kind of problem. The 9 remaining rockets in the first volley either hit the water alongside the ship or passed over. 3 detonated close enough to the hull above the waterline that their fragmentation swept exposed deck areas. 2 sailors on the port bridge wing were cut by fragmentation from these near misses. General quarters sounded at 1:17 and 12 seconds a.m., 4 seconds after the first impacts. The commanding officer, Captain Susan Alvarez, was in her sea cabin adjacent to the bridge when the rockets hit. The first impact, the one above the bridge, shook the ship hard enough that she was already moving before the alarm sounded. She was on the bridge in 11 seconds. The ship's response in the first 90 seconds was the result of training, adrenaline, and the instinct of experienced sailors. The 2 Mk-38 25mm chain gun crews reached their stations within 40 seconds of general quarters. They had been at elevated readiness as a standard Gulf patrol precaution. The port chain gun crew found the nearest boat at 150 meters to their port beam and opened fire without waiting for a formal command. The Mk-38 fires at 180 rounds per minute. At 150 meters, a sustained burst is not a surgical weapon. It is a wall of steel moving from the gun to the target. 6 seconds of firing, 18 rounds. The first burst was low. The crew adjusted. The second burst walked up the boat's hull from the waterline to the deck. At the 5th second of fire, whatever propellant or ordnance the boat was carrying detonated. The explosion was large, significantly larger than a 107mm rocket warhead, suggesting the boat had been carrying additional rocket reload stock. The fireball was visible from the ship's bridge. Boat 1 destroyed. The starboard chain gun crew engaged 2 boats coming up the starboard side. The first boat took hits and caught fire. It came to a stop and began sinking. The second boat maneuvered. Its helmsman turned hard, breaking the gun's firing solution for 4 critical seconds. The gun crew traversed to follow, lost the solution, fired anyway, missed. In those 4 seconds, the boat fired its second volley. 7 rockets from 75 meters. At 75 meters, the dispersion pattern is much tighter. 5 of the 7 rockets hit the ship or detonated close enough to cause damage. 1 struck the aft deck equipment area and detonated against a steel equipment housing. The explosion killed boatswain's mate First Class Daniel Kim, who had been moving to a covered position behind a winch housing when the rocket hit. The fragment pattern from the detonation went in every direction. He was 33 years old. He had served in the United States Navy for 12 years. His death is documented in 6 words in the official after-action report. BM-1, Kim KIA, aft deck 0118. He was one person. He was also the entire reason the engagement had consequences that outlasted the immediate tactical result. A second rocket from that volley struck the ship's communications mast structure aft of the bridge. The 107mm warhead detonated against the mast's steel structure and severed 2 of the 4 cable runs, serving the ship's primary satellite communications uplink antenna array. The antenna array itself was destroyed, the mounting bracket sheared, and the antenna fell to the deck. At 1:18:51 a.m., 1 minute and 43 seconds into the engagement, USS Gettysburg lost her primary external communications capability. She could not call for help. She could not receive threat updates from Fifth Fleet. She was fighting on VHF radio, short range, limited capability, and whatever her own sensors could tell her. The 2 SH-60B Seahawk helicopters, Tracker 31 and Tracker 32, had been airborne since 2300 on routine surface surveillance patrol, orbiting at low altitude south and east of USS Gettysburg, respectively. Both crews had been monitoring the ship's tactical communication. When the general quarters call went out at 1:17 and 12 seconds a.m., before the communications mast went down, both crews heard it and began repositioning immediately. Tracker 31, piloted by Lieutenant Margaret Sousa and co-piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Carlos Mendez, was the closer of the two, 6 nautical miles southeast of the ship when the alarm sounded. At 120 knots toward the ship, she covered that distance in 3 minutes. She arrived at 1:19:44 a.m. The engagement on the surface had been running for 2 minutes and 32 seconds. The FLIR camera picture that Lieutenant Sousa saw on her display was a complex tactical scene. USS Gettysburg centered in the frame, 8 boats remaining in the water around her at various ranges and bearings. At least 3 still actively maneuvering for attack runs, fires burning on the ship's superstructure, 2 boats already stopped or sinking. Sousa processed the picture in under 3 seconds and rolled into an attack. Her first Hellfire missile, an AGM-114 laser-guided munition with a shaped charge warhead, targeted the cluster of 3 boats approaching the ship's starboard quarter. The laser designator locked on the nearest boat. The missile flew from its mount at Mach 1.3, covered the 800-meter distance to the target in approximately 2 seconds, and struck the boat amidships. The detonation of the Hellfire's shaped charge warhead against a fiberglass fast boat loaded with rockets and fuel is not a contained event. The primary explosion ignited the boat's fuel supply and the remaining rocket propellant simultaneously. The secondary explosion was large enough to damage the 2 adjacent boats with blast overpressure and fragmentation. Both were stopped and flooding within 30 seconds. 3 boats accounted for in 11 seconds. Sousa's second Hellfire targeted the boat that had fired the close-range volley, the one responsible for BM-1 Kim's death and the communications mast damage. The boat had broken to port after its second rocket volley and was repositioning for another run. The laser locked. The missile flew. The detonation left nothing identifiable. Tracker 32 arrived 40 seconds after Tracker 31 and engaged the 2 boats circling the port beam. 1 Hellfire, 1 hit. Boat destroyed. The second boat, seeing the helicopter and seeing the destruction of the others, turned away from the ship at maximum speed heading northwest. The chain guns on the bridge wings were still working. The port gun crew, having destroyed their first target and survived the second volley from the starboard boat, was now tracking the 2 remaining boats visible on the port bow. One sustained direct hits and came to a stop, listing heavily. The other turned north at full speed. At one, the 2 surviving boats were running north. The helicopters did not pursue. Their role was ship defense, not chase. The boats disappeared into the dark. USS Gettysburg's short-range bridge-to-bridge VHF radio, which had survived the mast damage because it was physically mounted on the bridge wing rather than on the destroyed mast, reached Bahrain at 1:22 a.m. The transmission was brief. Captain Alvarez kept it to the minimum necessary content. Nav sent, Gettysburg, com degraded, boat attack complete, BM-1, Kim KIA, multiple WIA, ship operational, request immediate support. The duty officer in Bahrain had the response chain activated within 60 seconds. 2 FA-18Fs from USS Theodore Roosevelt were airborne at 1:30 a.m., 13 minutes after the attack began. They were not needed for the engagement itself, but they flew combat air patrol overhead for 90 minutes while USS Gettysburg assessed her damage, established backup satellite communications, and treated her wounded. The presence of the F/A-18S overhead was not militarily necessary at that point, but it was operationally significant. Any IRGC shore-based system that might have been considering a follow-on missile attack on a damaged, com-degraded U.S. cruiser now had to factor in 2 armed F/A-18S at altitude overhead. No follow-on attack materialized. Tracker 31, Lieutenant Seuss's helicopter, landed aboard at 1:34 a.m. to refuel and reload. During the post-landing inspection, the crew chief found 2 7.62mm bullet holes in the helicopter's lower fuselage, small arms fire from the boats during Seuss's attack runs. Neither round had struck anything critical. The hydraulic lines, fuel cells, and rotor assembly were all undamaged. Seuss had not reported being under fire during the engagement. She reported it on landing. When the debrief officer asked her why she hadn't called it, she said she hadn't wanted to distract the crew from the firing runs. The damage assessment took 6 hours of systematic survey. The forward superstructure hit had destroyed one equipment room completely. The fire, started by the rocket detonation, had spread to an adjacent communications relay space before the damage control team brought it under control at 1:31 a.m. The fire had been burning for 14 minutes. During that period, smoke had penetrated 3 additional compartments through ventilation ducting and forced the ship's damage control team to isolate sections of the ventilation system. The portside deck hit had destroyed the RHIB and its davit. No structural damage to the hull plating below the waterline. The communications mast damage was the most operationally serious. The satellite uplink antenna was completely destroyed. The 2 severed cable runs meant that even with a replacement antenna, only 2 of the 4 uplink channels were immediately restorable. Full primary communications capability was not restored until 6:15 a.m., after a repair team from Bahrain arrived by helicopter at 4:30 a.m. with replacement components. From 1:18 a.m. to 6:15 a.m., USS Gettysburg, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, one of the most capable warships in the world, was operating in the Persian Gulf with degraded external communications. For 4 hours and 57 minutes, the after-action review spent considerable time on what that gap would have meant in a different scenario. In a 2-phase attack, close-range boat assault followed by a missile strike from a distant platform, while the ship's crew was dealing with the boat damage and without full communications. The comm gap could have prevented the ship from receiving warning data, intercepting threat updates, or coordinating its air defense response. The IRGC had not executed a follow-on missile strike. The review assessed whether that was deliberate, whether the communications degradation was the intended outcome of the boat attack, setting up a follow-on that had not materialized for reasons that were unclear. The IRGC might have intended to strike and been deterred by the F/A-18S, or the 2-phase plan might not have been part of the design. The assessment was inconclusive. The possibility was documented. Boatswain's mate. First Class Daniel Kim was buried in Honolulu, Hawaii, 21 days after the engagement. He was survived by his wife, 2 daughters aged 7 and 4, and his parents. Captain Alvarez attended the service. The after-action review found 3 systemic failures. The first was the approach detection gap. The boat's slow-infiltration tactic, 9 boats drifting into attack positions at commercial vessel speeds over a 38-minute window, had not triggered the ship's threat classification system, which was calibrated to flag high-speed approaches but not coordinated slow convergence patterns. The fix required a new detection logic. If 5 or more small surface contacts within 6 nautical miles are simultaneously closing on a single vessel from different bearings, regardless of individual approach speed, the system generates an automatic alert. The modification was developed, tested, and deployed fleet-wide within 60 days. The second failure was the communications architecture. The satellite uplink antenna's mounting position on the aft mast structure had placed it in a location vulnerable to close-range attack on that bearing. The review recommended physical separation of primary and backup satellite communications terminals on all Ticonderoga and Arleigh Burke class ships. Many ships already had this. Gettysburg's backup terminal had been co-located during a recent communications upgrade, a design oversight with operational consequences. The third failure was the 4-second gap. From Petty Officer Jefferson's detection of the simultaneous boat acceleration to the first rocket impact was 8 seconds. 4 seconds of that gap was the time it took him to recognize the pattern, decide it was an attack, and reach for the alarm. 4 seconds. The review did not criticize Jefferson. It stated clearly that his response time was within normal parameters for an unexpected simultaneous multi-contact event. The system had not been designed to close that gap automatically. It was redesigned. A patrol coastal defense algorithm was added to the surface tracking software. Automatic alarm if contact closure rate exceeds 40 knots on any bearing with 3 or more simultaneous contacts. The algorithm would have sounded the alarm 3 seconds earlier than Jefferson's manual response. 3 seconds would not have stopped the rockets, but it would have given the chain gun's crews additional time to man their stations. In close-range combat, 3 seconds is not nothing. Stay vigilant, stay informed. This is Navy Beacon, and we'll see you in the next one.